So are there any announcements before I launch?
Okay,
No, I
there we
think
go. Yeah, I can do announcements now, or I can do them at the end. You want me to do them now?
let's do them now. Let's do them
Okay,
now.
okay. So hi, everyone. Thank you, Tony, for being here. Jen is away, who usually does announcements, so I'll be doing announcements tonight. I want to introduce Robin Hennon to everybody. She's on the admin team here at Mountain Stream. Happy to have her on board with us and happy to have her here with us tonight. So tomorrow night, Tuesday, we usually do our sit and sangha group, and we're going to cancel it because there's so much snow still in the parking area. We don't want people getting hurt. Yeah, recording.
So when Marcia got a hold of me and asked what I was be talking about, I was really pleased that we're in almost spring. I mean, you guys don't see it, but the arboretum down here is blooming and with all kinds of interesting things. And in the spring, it's become a habit of mine to uh, revisit the refuges. It's something I do every year because thinking about the refuges includes thinking about all aspects of Dharma practice. And each year things change and insights deepen and perspective shifts. And I've kept notes for 20 years now of doing this. I teach in a half a dozen groups around. And in the spring, I always do something on the refuges. So I thought I was just really pleased that I get to talk with you about these because it's so important. And it's something that we all know about them. We recite them in Pali, we chant them in English. But, usually, in my experience, most of the time we're saying, I take refuge in the Buddha. I like the Buddha. I like the Dharma. I like the Sangha. Um, let's get on to the meditation. But there's a huge benefit to investigating the refuges. And I want to start by looking at the word taking refuge versus finding refuge. So we can turn to the Dharma for refuge. It's an act of will. It's something we intend to do, and we can intentionally turn to the Dharma, turn to the Buddha, turn to the Sangha for refuge. But there's a question about whether once you turn to them, do you actually find refuge there? And what kind of refuge are we talking about? The word refuge refers to a place of safety. And we know that there isn't safety in this world. The Buddha often pointed that out. But I think what we're talking about is refuge from the suffering that's caused by ignorance, from the second dart. The Buddha talks about the two darts, the first being the dart of the first noble truth: aging, sickness, death, pain, distress, not getting what you want. The first dart, the Buddha says all beings experience the first dart, but the awakened ones don't experience the second dart, the one that is actually self-inflicted out of ignorance. And it's what the second noble truth is talking about. It's the second dart. And so really what refuge is about is refuge from craving, from what the Buddha said, the cause of that, the arising of that second dart comes out of our disposition to want things the way we want them. We want pleasant experience. We want to keep on keeping on. Tanha. So it's refuge from that, refuge from wanting and hating and fearing and believing our stories. So how does the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, how do they provide refuge, freedom from the second dark? Let's think about refuge, taking refuge in the Buddha. Who do we think the Buddha is? The guy's not around these days. And each of us have an idea in our mind of who he is. Some ideas may be fuzzier, some may be cartoon-like, some might be, I mean, everybody's got all kinds of ideas about who the Buddha is. And I think that the Buddha, how we imagine the Buddha as the awakened one, who's whatever it was he did 2,500 years has got us still talking about it. So what do we think he is? You know, some people think that there are large numbers of people who have models of the Buddha being born out of his mother's side. In the Majjhima, you can read about how the Buddha was, upon his birth, he took 7 steps, and you know, there's all kinds of stories. What's the big deal? What do we think? You know, are we worshiping a god? Do we think of him as transcendent somehow? Many of the Mahayana writings treat him as something divine from a different realm, perhaps. You know, what is our model of an awakened being? What do you think of when you think of an awakened being? If you go to Google and type in Arhat images, they're all monks sitting in meditation. You know, the images of the Buddha. This is our image of awakened, of an awakened life. You know, but I'm not sure that the Buddha's awakening was conditioned by lifestyle. You know, my friend Musang, who teaches at the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies, says the most important decision the Buddha made was to remain a monk. And that's been a koan for me for quite some time. What does that mean? You know, is the Buddha because he can do exotic meditation? You know, because he can scale the jhanas real easy, or you know, the Buddha, there's a phrase that shows up throughout the canon, throughout the early texts, where the Buddha describes someone's awakening, and he says, birth is ended, the holy life fulfilled, the task is done, there is nothing further in this world. That's the Buddha, nothing further in this world. Pretty stunning, actually. You know, imagine an awakened mind. And you know, we imagine an awakened mind, we don't necessarily automatically think that the heart needs to be awakened too. You know, there's a poem by Rilke which talks about a guy whose gaze was so profound, so intense, that the animals came to stand in his gaze, and he saw clearly the nature of all things. But you know, he was condemned because he didn't bring love to the vision. You know, the heart is a really important part. Now, the Buddha was sitting in meditation, and we talk about the enlightened mind, but also the enlightened heart has to go with that. You know? And I think, what if someone became fully awakened in Sacramento today? Whatever fully awakened means. You have, you know, for me, fully awakened suggests that upadana, greed, hatred, delusion, wanting, hating, fearing, and believing, that those things are no longer triggered. But some insight has shown how they're no longer. The Buddha had an insight into things that enabled him to not be triggered. I remember reading about how he described meditating in the woods, in the jungles, and he would hear animals, and that would give rise to fear. And he would stop and wait until the fear passed. That's how he dealt with that and learned to do that. Well, full awakening. I don't think it's dependent on lifestyle. And I think that a fully awakened, whatever that means, life is possible in a lay setting. There's maybe it's Glenn Wallace, somebody in Boulder, who I keep forgetting who said it, made a joke about how you take one of those meditation masters in a cave in the Himalayas, bring them to Boulder and give them a wife, a couple kids, a mortgage, a job, and a subscription to cable TV. And, his life would be very different. And what would that life be like? I mean, what is an arhat? Dalai Lama, Desmond Tutu, I think of Greta Thunberg. I think that we can look for models of an awakened life that don't always have to be a monastic. Bernie Glassman was a street minister. A fully engaged heart, informed by wisdom, can be the model for lay arhatship. Anyway, who we think the Buddha was and what we think he did is our model of what we think we can attain. So it becomes the idea, the fully awakened one. There's a movie that I watched recently, which is on Netflix, and it's actually pretty good. It's a thriller, but it's a thriller designed for a one-act play. And so it occurs in one set, and it's not a shoot 'em up. It's just intense, and it takes place in the shop of a tailor, who at one point is stitching up a suit, and he says, "Well, of course, when you're doing this work, your mind is on perfection, even though you can't attain it. But without the model of perfection, you get lost." Is this good enough? Good enough, maybe. I did 2 hours, whatever. But the idea of the fully awakened being may be skillful means. How do we imagine what the Buddha attained and what we have attained? So refuge in the Buddha is refuge in the idea that freedom from the suffering that we cause ourselves, it's that freedom. It's the idea that it's possible. What is refuge in the Dharma? The teachings of the Buddha. I think of the Dharma that comes to us today as sort of like the end of a 2,500-year game of telephone. There's a lot of noise in there. Some of the teachings have been stepped on. Some people didn't understand the Dharma and tried to interpret it their way. How do we know? How do we know what the Buddha taught? There are a couple of solutions out there. What Stephen Batchelor did was to look at the contents of the Pali Canon and then the writings that were ambient at the time. And he looked at what was present in the canon that wasn't ambient at the time, or what the Buddha added, what the Buddha brought to the table. So, for example, the first 4 precepts were the precepts that guided Brahman life, not to to kill, not to steal, not to engage in harmful sexual behavior, and not to speak falsely. These were ambient at the time, and the Buddha liked to poke fun at that. He said, you know, a stupid baby boy lying on the ground doesn't do any of those things. So you're telling me that the highest ethical attainment is that of a stupid baby boy lying on the ground? So what, you know, so Stephen Batchelor looked at those differences and he said, what's in the canon that's not ambient at the time? Mindfulness meditation, the mindfulness practice, dependent origination, the notion of emptiness and the dependent nature of all things. The framing of the Four Noble Truths as the origin of dukkha, the origin of suffering. Those are the primary. Also, you know, other things about self-responsibility. You don't go to the Brahmins for your liberation. You have to do it yourself. But there are things, you know, that's Stephen Batchelor's solution. So the Dharma for him would be those things. Analio Bhikkhu, who is a fairly serious scholar. I don't know anyone who's more serious than him or more productive, actually. You know, his solution is just to not look at anything after King Ashoka. I asked him to do a course that I was doing, and I wanted him to do something on the three baskets, and he wouldn't, because he said the Abhidhamma is too late. So that's his solution. Try to get at what the Buddha taught. I think even with all the noise that's out there, we can all get the signal that the Buddha was concerned about dukkha and the end of dukkha, and that the Dharma, you know, it's instructions for refraining from launching the second dart. It's instructions for ending suffering that's caused by ignorance. And we don't do that by telling ourselves what to do, you know, telling yourself to let go or try harder or more energy. Those kinds of exhortations don't work so well. Usually what works is insight into the nature of what's going on. And then through that very vision, freedom arises, you know. And so I think that the refuge of the Dharma is the refuge is the refuge in practice and not in consoling narratives. You know? So it's refuge in practice. It's in practice of the precepts and the practice of mindfulness. Mindfulness is pretty much, we sort of know what we're talking about, maybe, unless you try to sit down and write a couple of sentences to describe it. And then you realize how muzzy your conception is. But precept practice, the practices of the heart side, you know, precept practice is often taught as, you know, rules that you can breaking a precept. I don't think that any of that is helpful. You know, don't kill, don't steal are pretty primitive. I mean, none of us have problems with that most of the time. And they've been sort of reformatted to don't cause harm, don't take what's not freely given, you know, don't speak falsely. I'm leaving off the fifth precept, but the idea of all of these, if they're taken as rules, they'll fail. I mean, don't take what's not freely given. How about a gun from a child? or car keys from somebody who's been drinking too much. Don't speak falsely. You know, what if the Nazis ask if Anne Frank is home? You know, I've heard senior teachers say you have to finesse that question because you're not supposed to lie. I think you lie. And you lie as convincingly as you can. I mean, if you try to hedge, remember, you know, Bill Clinton and what the meaning of is, that doesn't work. You know, you just, so there are times when the only ethical thing to do may be not in accord with the precept. The precepts are guides. And I think really the bottom line precept is not to make things worse. It's really what all of those precepts are about. You know, not killing, not harming. You know, if you saw Adam Lanza heading into the Newtown school with weapons and you had a weapon, you would stop him. I think, I hope, you know, in the interest of evading much greater suffering. So, you know, the Dharma, refuge in the Dharma is refuge in the practice that you do, not in a consoling narrative. It's in the precept practice, your work on that, and in your mindfulness practice. Dharma, let me say one more thing. Dharma Dharma practice is performance. You know, when the Buddha was asked what is full understanding, he said full understanding is the absence of greed, hatred, and delusion. So he was talking about the absence of understanding in terms of the intentions that understanding gives rise to. You know, the Dharma ultimately is going to be implicit. You can't speak it, but you can articulate it in your life. It's like riding a bicycle. That's implicit knowledge. You know, but you can't articulate how to ride a bike. Even our theories about how to ride a bike for years were wrong. Getting momentum going and spinning wheels and gyroscopic yada yada. But you articulate your knowledge of riding a bike by riding the bike, or your knowledge of how to use your language by using the language. So the Dharma is articulated in one's behavior, one's actions, and one's intentions. And then let me say something about, and then so that's where refuge is. Refuge is in your practice. You know, sometimes it's kind of confusing. Well, let's talk about the Sangha. Refuge in the Sangha, because, you know, the word Sangha has had a lot of meanings. The time of the Buddha, the Sangha was the collection of arhats in the Buddha's circle. After the Buddha was gone, the Sangha became the monastic community. And there's still places where that's the understanding. There's a Vajrapani is a monastery in the Santa Cruz Mountains where John and I used to do retreats there 30 years ago. And it's a monastery. There are some nuns in residence. And in the food line, at the beginning of the food line, there's a sign that says, out of courtesy, we serve Sangha first. And that meant the monastics first. So that was the meaning of Sangha. And then, of course, the Dharma comes to the West and it becomes a group, a community. You know, we all think of Sanghas and you know, this is a Sangha. I got my Sangha in Davis. There's bigger Sanghas here and whatever. We all like to call these Sanghas. And we have Sangha propaganda. We all know about the story about how Ananda is looking out over the sea of assembled arhats and monastics and says, gee, this Sangha business is pretty important, must be half the holy life. And the Buddha says, don't say that, Ananda. You know the story. It's all the holy life. On the other hand, there are places, many places, where the Buddha said, if you can't find a kalyanamitta, a spiritual friend, if you can't find a good companion, walk alone like a tusker elephant in the woods. So the idea of Sangha it's a functional idea. Kalyanamitta, one who will help you on the path of awakening. So, we've got Sanghas, but the West we've really changed things a lot. If the Sangha is where you go for the teachings, you could seek refuge in the Arhat community at the time of the Buddha. You could seek refuge in the monastic community, but here, where do you go for teachings? We have mushed up everything. 150 years ago, if you lived in Southeast Asia, you probably got access to Theravadan Buddhism. If you lived in Tibet, you got access to Tibetan Buddhism. If you lived in Japan, etc. But now here we have access to everything. Now we have not everything. We've got access to a lot of Dharma teaching. And how do we decide what's important? You've got one Burmese master teaching that you can't even do Vipassana practice until you've mastered all 8 jhanas. And you've got another Burmese teacher talking about choiceless awareness. How do you know which is which? Doubt is one of the things that can show up, and doubt, of course, is a hindrance. Now you don't actually need a teacher there because of the internet. There are practices without teachers, teachings without teachers, or you can listen to any old teacher. You can listen to Gil Fronsdal if you're in Australia, so it's planetary. And we assemble our understanding of the Dharma from a lot of different places. We may have a home Sangha, but we also read this book and that book and listen to that video and follow that teacher. And Sangha has become personal for each of us. The Sangha that we turn to for the teachings, each of us has a different constellation. I'm thinking that Sangha, it's a culture of awakening, but it includes so much. And also, Sangha for us, each of us becomes who you walk with. People who have a similar agenda as you that you can work with, where we find our instruction and our shared practice. The Vinaya is what kept Sanghas together, and it's shared practice that keeps us together. What the practice you do makes a difference. So how, you've got Pao Ok and U Tejaniya, both Burmese masters, saying, this is the path. And you go, well, it's like the donkey who's got the basket of corn and a basket of oats and doesn't know which to eat, so he starves to death. This is vicikicca. This is skeptical doubt. Overcoming that, learning to recognize the Dharma. How do we recognize the Dharma? How do we detect the difference between a fruitful path and a dry hole or a dead end? So I think the Sangha feels to me these days in ways that it didn't when I look at my notes 10 years ago. It feels to me like a concept that has just undergone major major shift in the landscape it's trying to map. And so I think of Sangha now, refuge in Sangha, you know, is what you find. You find refuge. What kind of refuge? What kind of safety? What kind of practice? So, you know, it's the taking refuge or finding refuge includes everything. Your understanding of what you're doing, what you're shooting for, what the ideal would be. And, you know, I think opening our minds to other possibilities other than a sitting monk might get us to think a little bit about what awakened life can be in a lay setting, and to pay close attention to how we understand the teachings and how our practice relates to the teachings. And finally, you know, let's look at the way in which we're finding the Dharma, what Dharma we're finding, because there's plenty of stuff out there that, you know, we might think is a little crazy, and there's plenty of stuff that's helpful, and we have to do that work. I think in some ways we have to assemble our own refuge, our own Sangha as refuge. So it's what we think we're doing, how we think we're doing it, and where we go to get instructions and help along the way. Is anything left out? No. So let me, you know, offer this as a model for inquiry. And you don't have to do it every year, but, you know, if you take notes, it really helps, I find, to take notes. And then you can, first of all, you see what you're actually thinking and you go, oh no, that can't be right. And you can look at what you were doing last year and you say, oh boy, I'm older and wiser now. Or you could look back and then say, geez, I can't believe I wrote that. That's pretty good. I can't do that now. But the idea is to maintain the refuges as objects of contemplation. So let me pause and invite you, please, to turn off your mute buttons, and you know, we can talk about the refuges or any Dharma subject that falls within the refuges, I think. Hi, Constance.
Hi. What was the movie you watched on Netflix?
Oh, it was called The Outfit.
Thank you.
Hey, Tony, it's Marie.
Yeah.
So I like, you know, and I'll try not to make this too long. Just a few things came up on I did Google Arhat and saw a bunch of monks and, you know, male paintings and statues and so forth. And as I was scrolling through, what came up for me was, if I'm going to see a doctor or a gynecologist, I would go to a female doctor or gynecologist. Do you have any recommendations on, so one thing that, you know, if I may be blunt, you know, that kind of frustrates me with Buddhism is the maleness of it.
Well, you know, that's out of the tradition. Yeah. you can get over that. I don't think that maleness. I don't think maleness is inherently part of the Dharma. There's a great story that Sun Sunim tells or told when he was alive. There's a Zen master who from Korea, and he was in Cambridge and in Providence, and when he would do a talk, everybody in the sangha would sit according to rank. So the senior disciples were right in front, and the new people in the back. And Barbara Rhodes tells this story about, as she put it in her blog, she was his first, the first person that he granted Inca to transmission to. And he was giving a Dharma talk, and at the end of the talk, he invited people to question, and people said, you talk about, he this, he that, what about women? And Sun Sunim looks at him and says, women can't get enlightened. Thank you very much. And he gets up and walks out the back door, and Barbara gets up and chases him out. I mean, she's his senior disciple. And she grabs him and says, Sun Sunim, what do you mean women can't get enlightened? And he looks at her and he says, oh, are you a woman? Don't make man, don't make woman, just save all beings. That's what he said.
It's good. So here's the other piece. First, I like mush. When you were mentioning about the mush, that's one thing I'm appreciating is listening to various teachers. There's always like the various perspectives, or some insight that gets shared. That's nice about the mush. And then the last thing is, with the refuge, I always think of seeking refuge in self, like just how so much of this is about going inward instead of looking outward so much, and with investigation and to sit and to be quiet and not be especially as lay people, to not be so outward. I always think of that being a fourth refuge.
Well, my mind is not coming up with the title of this thing. There's a very famous Zen master, I think it was Dogen, who wrote, to study the self is to forget the self. To study the Dharma is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be enlightened by the 10,000 things. So the thing about self is it's just a mirage. It's like a mirage in the road. It sure looks like water. Sure looks like me, self. But really, when you look for it, it evaporates just like a mirage. So refuge, to study the Dharma is to, there's a name for that it's a longish poem, not that long. It's not like Evangeline, but it's a longish piece that starts with, to study the Dharma is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. And to forget the self is to be enlightened by the 10,000 things. So I think that new models of awakened life, what would happen if you became a fully awakened being, whatever you think that means? What do you think that means? And how would that change what you would do in your daily life? I know that there is a traditional understanding. Pauak said that if you were to become fully enlightened, you have 48 hours to get to a monastery. I'm not sure why 48 hours, and I'm not sure what the story is there, but I guess the idea is that if you're fully awakened, you got to live like a monk. Of course, if you ask him if he's fully awakened, he won't tell you anything, because monks are prohibited from describing their spiritual attainments. Anything else about the refuges?
Yeah, when you were talking about Dharma and you were explaining how, it's changed over the millennia with all the different interpretations. And it really reminds me, like the Dharma can be different depending upon who you are in the life that you live and what comes across. And it reminds me of a story of, it's an allegory, supposedly a story of a famous teacher, Swami person, but you hear all these stories and they cross traditions. But there's a wise teacher and you have to go over in a boat over to see him. And so he has one dedicated disciple who goes over there, and as he's crossing the boat, there's a couple other people in there and he hears them talking bad about his teacher. And he gets really angry and he threatens to tip the boat over, and like if they don't stop talking bad about his teacher or whatever. So he gets over across the river and he sees his teacher and he's like, I heard some people talking bad about you and I yelled at them and threatened them, because you're my teacher and I'm defending you. And he's like, no, your job is to be quiet, because instead of terrifying these people, that's not dharmic, that's not like the proper way of action. You're not protecting me, you're like practicing, like you're letting your ego take over.
Yeah.
And then there's another disciple and he goes across the boat and he's a much more quiet person, and he hears the people talking about him or about his teacher, and he doesn't say anything. And he comes to his teacher and he's like, oh, teacher, I heard these people talking bad about you, but I didn't let it affect me. I didn't say anything. I was like calm and equanimous. And the teacher says, you fool, you should have said something. So it's like for the angry person, he needs to practice, restraint. And for the cowardly person, he needs to practice the, speaking up for himself and for others. And so it's like, depending upon what these people have to work or whatever their challenges are, it changes the right action that they're supposed to do.
I think you're absolutely right. There's no way to take your life out of your environment. Your life is embedded in it, just like we're embedded in the biosphere. There's one thing the Buddha said that about his teaching that has been a really powerful guide to me. He said, I teach a Dharma that does not contend with anyone, that does not dispute with anyone. And that tells me that if your vision of the Dharma and my vision of the Dharma are different, that's different. But when you have to make your vision of the Dharma the one, and you get into quarrels and disputes, whatever you're quarreling over isn't whether there is such a thing as reincarnation or whether there is such a thing as karma. What you're arguing about is not the Dharma. The Dharma does not contend. So contention and dispute, even when it just arises in your mind, oh, they're wrong. That's the story behind anger. They're wrong, I'm right. That's a big story behind anger. So yeah, the Dharma doesn't contend. It's articulated in your life. Priscilla, were you going to ask something?
Yes.
You're muted. I don't know whether it looked like you were reaching for something.
I guess I thought of this and then I realized it was really not very pertinent. And the thought it just came to me about, like, as far as refuge goes, would there be any other refuges?
Ah,
Because I think what we are just talking about now, in other words, like the very distinctive nature of how to use the Dharma in your own life and how that varies so tremendously, is in a sense a kind of, refuge also, to be able to see with expansion and to see with an open heart.
absolutely. The refuge, the fruit of the practice would be to find refuge in your daily living.
Yeah, yeah. That it would be an expansive experience.
Yes,
It's very, we've, spent a lot of time really talking well about the specifics of each one of these. But I think in terms of the application,
sure. The idea in talking about them is to bring your attention to features of the Buddha's teaching and the path to freedom from the suffering that we create out of ignorance. How not to make matters worse. How not to make things worse. Seems to me the prime precept.
these are like guideposts, really. And
Absolutely.
uh,
Don't make things worse. I really do think that's the Buddha's deepest teaching. Don't you inflict the second arrow. Don't act out of greed, hatred, and delusion. And the interpretation of what would make things worse is based on your insight into the nature of the suffering in that particular moment. Meryl.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the song when you were talking about the song. You talked about a lot, and some of it I could follow, and some of it is still really new to me. But the refuge and the sangha for me, and the elephant, talking about the elephant going alone. I don't know. I was just thinking about, like, if the elephant had always went alone, then not that you can't go it alone, but that you need this. For me, and I can only speak personally for me, you need the sangha when it's new to you, because you've been part of this
I
really
agree.
burnout society, and I burnt out last year. And so, and I needed the sangha to show me that it was okay to suffer,
Sure.
to show me the way out of suffering. And I needed the sangha to reflect back to me what it was to I like what you said about, like, what enlightenment, because maybe enlightenment's not like this. I haven't met the Buddha either. I don't know. I didn't meet Christ. And I mean, in a way, I guess I did. We're all the lineage of these beings, but to reflect back to me moments and seconds. And that brought me into listening to a talk from one of Ajahn Chah's disciples, talking about translating his stuff into verses, and how at some point you quit sitting and meditating because your life is just a meditation. And then that brought me to your current topic, where you just don't make things worse. And I don't know, it was interesting. So thank you.
Sure. Last thoughts? Complaints?
The more women thing, we need more women.
Oh, come on. Don't hide your lamp under a bush. Or is that a saying?
from the
Yes.
bottom.
Well, thank you. It was a treat to see you. I haven't been up to see you guys at least since the pandemic. So it's just really a treat.
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you, Tony. I hope
Yeah,
you can
thank
come
you.
to the center at some point when you're feeling like traveling a bit.
Okay, I'm being cautious about COVID because I have two friends who just got sick, and closing in on 80. It's something to be avoided, I think.
Yes.
I'm basically a Zoom hermit.
The virtual Sangha. What do you think about the virtual Sangha?
Yeah.
I am able to, I have a study group that includes 2 people in Australia, 2 people in Washington, D.C., and a woman in North Carolina. And me.
Very
And,
cool.
that's a virtual Sangha that's,
Expansion.
it's expansive. The Coastside Sangha where I have been visiting pretty regularly for more than 10 years. One of the guys moved to Oregon, but he still joins the virtual Sangha because there he is. There are people in my Davis group who would not be able to make the drive. So virtual sanghas give you things, and let me just my wife Tony said, don't ask whether ChatGPT can be a Kalyana Mitta, but if you're there, give it a try.
Dennis Warren sent me an article about mindfulness written from ChatGPT.
Oh yeah, it can be stupid, but it has to do with the quality of the question you pose. I asked it to discuss the relationship between dependent origination and emptiness, and it did a pretty good job in less than 20 seconds.
What are you reading?
What?
This is Sharon, but I'm curious what you are reading. Where do you find your Dharma?
Well, right now I find myself working through the Abhidhamma, and following where those contemplations lead me. The Abhidhamma was a teaching device. It was not meant as a book of philosophy. It was the lists are teaching tools, and they were taught in relation, intimate relation between the teacher and the student. And so the lists are available. There's not so many teachers teaching them, but there are some people starting to write some books about it, and I'm exploring that myself. That's what I'm doing.
Which version of the Abhidhamma are you reading?
Well, the Pali version, and I'm mostly focused on the Jatakas. I spent some time last fall on working on the difference between doubt and faith, between Vicikiccha and Saddha, because one goes with the dark qualities, and one goes with mindfulness and the bright qualities.
There's good doubt and afflicted doubt too.
I'm sorry. Somebody's muted. Was that you, Cindy?
I just mentioned that there's kind of good doubt and afflicted doubt. There's the afflicted doubt that takes us
That's
away,
right.
and then there's our questions that are really important to
Yeah.
our learning and our path.
Yeah. There's the doubt is just I don't believe. There's it's just I'm not sure. But the afflictive doubt is the doubt that doesn't know what to believe and doesn't know how to go about deciding, and is stuck.
Or doubting virtue as opposed to, believing in non-virtue.
Yeah. And not sure what virtue is, and so you don't know what to do. Yeah. Confusion related to a moha and avijja.
But then how also faith and doubt can work together, to kind of stir the pot and use that faith to help you with your doubt.
Well, faith is a really bad translation of Saddha, And Vichikicha, you can render it as doubt, but it really is skeptical doubt. It's not just doubt. So there's a lot there.
Yeah, there's different types of faith too, right? So
Well, faith is a weird translation for it because the word sada, the root of that word, means to have confidence in, which
Mhm.
is different than faith, because faith suggests to us in the West belief without evidence. And that's sort of the cultural baggage that we've got because of the way our culture relates to that word.
right, but if we move away and we look at, for example, faith with reason, which you just alluded to, you know, from what we learn and what's logical and what's reasonable and what we've had from experience. And also when we look at people like Mother Teresa or Gandhi or the Dalai Lama as examples, or Buddha as examples for us to follow as a part of our faith as well.
Well, you know, the word sada in the 37 Ways of Awakening shows up in two places, both as a spiritual faculty and as a spiritual power. And the powers and the faculty, those lists are the same. And there's a difference between the two. And when faith is full confidence, then it becomes a power that drives to awakening. You know, it's a capability that we can cultivate if we know what we're cultivating. That's the value of the Abhidhamma for me. It's like a lot of fingers pointing at the moon, and so you take those pointers and try to find what they're pointing at. So that's what my own work has been in for probably about the past year. What a treat, you guys. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you, Tony.
Take
I think
care.
you're-
Thank you, Tony. Good night, everyone.
You're
Good night.
teaching sometime on Thursday night this month, right? You're teaching on the 16th on Thursday.
Me?
You are, yeah.
Oh, is it the Auburn group?
Yep.
Oh, I'm probably going to talk about the refuges. It's spring, right? It's
Spring.
March. So
Okay.
you'll get the same thing largely.
Thanks, Tony.
Okay, good night, you guys.
Good night.
Night, everyone.
Night.